Hello everyone, this is Nikolai from Product Intelligence, and today I want to show you how to add a new metric to service ping using the instrumentation class framework. To do so, we're gonna follow 3 steps. First, we're gonna generate instrumentation class file and fill its implementation. Then we're gonna generate the metric definition file and fill its missing attributes. And finally, we're gonna test the new metric. So let's start with this step 1. And we're gonna use the Rails generator that was prepared by the Product Intelligence team. And to copy the terminal command, let's visit the documentation page. Let's grab the command and get back to the terminal. Let's paste the command and let's make some small adjustments. First, we need to adjust the instrumentation class name to match what we actually metric we want to create. And for the purpose of this exercise, let's say that we want to count authors who created the confidential issues. So let's change the name, count authors creating confidential issues. Then we also need to pass the type. In this case, the type of database is what we're going to use. It informs what data source would be used to calculate the underlying metric. And we can use database for our purpose. Then we also need to specify the operation for the metric to use. It will be count, distinct count, sometimes sum. For more details, please visit our documentation. In case of this particular metric, let's use distinct count. We could also add the if flag if the metric would be created for only for the enterprise edition, but we want to track it on the regardless of the edition. So let's give it as it is and run the generator command. This generator command is going to create 2 files for us. First would be the metrics instrumentation file, and the other would be the spec file that we're gonna use to test the instrumentation class itself. And here they are. So let's start with the instrumentation class. And we have almost everything ready for us. We only need to specify a column that we want to track. By default, it uses the relation primary key. However, because we want to count the other column in our exercise, let's specify it explicitly. And last missing bit is the relation here. We need to pass the active record relation for the sake of the database metric. That's gonna select all the records that we want to count. So we want to count issues which set the confidential. And that should be just enough to fill out the instrumentation metric instrumentation class body. So let's go to the spec file. There's also small bits required here. First, we need to specify time frame that we want to calculate over, and let's say that we want to count all. We want to count all with all historical data, and for that we specify the time frame all, and we also need to set expected value. And that would be in this case, for example, 1. We can set it as we want. Then we just need to create matching records. So let's do that. So let's create the one confidential issue. And set it as confidential. That should be enough. We can now run the spec file. So let's just copy the path for convenience here. And run it. Once we are sure that everything works correctly, we can move onwards to the next step and generate the metrics definition file. But let's wait for the test output to show up. And we can see that it passed, which is great. So let's take on with the next step, which is generating the metrics definition file that contains some metadata and also works as a sort of a config that instruct how to build the service ping payload with the instrumentation classes. So let's go to the documentation. There is also additional race generator that can help us to generate the metrics definition. So let's copy it and paste. Okay, there's also a couple adjustments to be made in here. So let's maybe clean the terminal to make it more visible. First, we need to pass the metrics key path. This is the location where the metrics would be placed in the service ping payload, which is just a JSON object, which means that this path has to be unique in the scope of the object in order to avoid the collision. There are a couple of conventions and the keys that can be used and to properly structure the payload. For more details, please visit the documentation. And for our purpose, let's select some key path for our metric. We have the top level key, which is counts, which hosts all time that metrics that collects the data from the all historical data, which matches our case. But the other part of it doesn't really match our needs. So let's rename it to match our metric instrumentation. So we have authors creating confidential issues. And then we need to also appoint in which subdirectory in the config directory this metric definition will be placed. It's based on the time frame. Since we already decided we want to track all available historical data, we need to place it in the counts all directory. And lastly, we need to pass the metric instrumentation class name. So let's copy it. And that would be enough. You can invoke the generator right now. It's going to prepare the metrics YAML file for us with some attributes pre-filled that we can then adjust and make ready for the release. And we have our file generated. So let's open it and make small adjustments. So we have the key path as we specified it. For now, we can skip the name attribute. We can add some description to help other teams understand what we are tracking here. Maybe they could reuse it. Then we can specify the metadata about the product stage, about section stage and group that owns the metric that helps other teams to find the owner and ask about some questions that may have or helps us to notify the correct person if there are some issues with the metric. Then we also can pass the introduced by URL if we have it, as be the merge request URL, and finally we can pass the data source, which is the database in this case. And that should be just enough to complete the second step. So now we are left with the final step, which is testing if this all works together. Lucky for us, there's this step is automated. It will be automatically invoked by the CI, but if anyone wants to get the quicker feedback loop and test it on the local instance, it's possible to just invoke spec file that assures that the all metrics definitions and the instrumentations works together as expected. So let's invoke it and see if we completed our task successfully. And as you can see, the test file was completed successfully, which means that everything works together as expected. And our task is done. Now we can just commit our changes and create the merge request to add a new metric to the service ping. Thank you very much.